Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Entry Level Esports. My name is Trent, and as always, we're going to be taking your questions from Twitter and Reddit and answering them related to Heroes of the Storm, esports in general, whatever it is that you might have questions about. Today, we've got a question from Reddit submitted by PeatypeteC, who asks, "It was said by a pro player that Spacestation and Old Gods were the only NA teams with tryouts this past roster apocalypse. What do you think about that?" And so what I wanted to do today is use that question as an opportunity to talk about why an HGC team would decide to hold tryouts, and as a result of that, why only 2 teams decided to have tryouts this past offseason. So, and I have confirmed that these 2 teams did in fact hold tryouts, and we're going to stay just within North America for this conversation, since that's the question that was asked, rather than discussing the teams specifically in EU, China, Korea, any of those regions. So first, we need to understand what is the purpose of a tryout for an HGC team. And at its most basic level, a tryout is just a way to figure out who the best available player is for your roster. So if your team were to release its support player, and you don't have anybody else on your team that you want to move into that position, you need to find somebody for that role. So you might hold a tryout to figure out who the best support player is to join your team. Tryouts are going to include mechanical skill, individual mechanics, knowledge about your role, as well as fit within the team. Those are kind of the main 3 things that you're looking at with a tryout. Now, if you're holding a tryout, there's sort of an understood implication that there's not a clear right answer for your roster. What that means is that essentially the players that you're trying out want to be on your team more than you necessarily want them to be on your team, because there's not someone within that pool that stands out so much more than everybody else that you immediately pick them up without a tryout. So holding a tryout essentially implies that there's a question mark about who you should pick up. So what we're going to do is look at each of the new 2018 NA-HGC teams and try to figure out which of those teams didn't have a clear answer as to who they were going to pick up in the offseason to fill the holes in their roster. Now, before we jump into that, we need to quickly talk about the disparity between the Open Division and the HGC teams, especially the established, more long-standing teams, in terms of talent, capability, experience, those factors, because that really informs a lot of why certain teams didn't hold tryouts, in addition to the fact that the HGC rules as they stand currently prevent teams from picking up players in other regions. So it would be utterly impossible for Tempo Storm to grab a player like Rich, or for Old Gods to convince a highly rated player in Europe like Schwimpy to join their roster. So that limits the total pool of high-profile free agents that a team could pick up. And if you watch Open Division play or you watch the Crucible, you'll see that there really is a substantial gap between the majority of players in Open Division and the majority of players in HGC, both in terms of skill, in terms of fit, and in terms of experience. So that leads to a lot of teams not wanting to take a risk on an Open Division player because most of those players have not stood out enough to impress beyond needing a tryout to prove their worth in the HGC. So because of that disparity between the Open Division and the HGC, most teams, if they can, are going to pick somebody who's an established pro player within the HGC. So with that understood, let's take a look at the teams. So as with last year, we've got 8 teams in the 2018 NA-HGC. First, we're going to look at the 2 new teams that are joining the HGC, Heroes Hearth and LFM, both because of the way that they joined the league this season, are not allowed to make any roster changes under HGC rules. They can't drop players. They can't pick up players. If something catastrophic happens, then things will change like Team 8 had with Chew 8. But outside of something like that, where a player literally decides that they're not going to play and gets banned, these teams cannot make roster changes. So there was no way for them to either pick up other players or to hold a tryout. So they're out of the running already. The next team we look at is Tempo Storm. Tempo Storm picked up Glaurung and Fan, and Tempo Storm is an organization that needs to keep being at the top. They, when they're building their roster, are looking to win right now. They're looking to get to 2018's BlizzCon, every international competition they can next year, and win the NAHGC. They're not interested in rebuilding any more than they have to. They're not looking to take any major risks that could potentially put them further down the standings. They want to go with known quantities that are going to keep their team at the top of the standings. In addition to that, Caterpillar and Glaurung are roommates. They live together. They're friends. And Fan and June also have a very strong relationship due to living together. So those players wanted to join forces in order to have more fun playing the game, play with people they already know they get along with, and every member that joined that team is a very, very strong individual player. So you know that against most teams in the HGC, you're probably going to be able to just outskill your opponents because you have better shot calling, better drafting, and better mechanical players than most of the other teams in the region. This is why, if you go back and read some of my off-season literature that I wrote about my predictions for how these teams would perform, I predict that Tempo Storm is going to be a good team, but they may not perform the best internationally, because what they've done is they've essentially put together a number of talented players that are just better than a lot of other players in the league and in the open division, so that they can win right now. And as a result of that, they knew the players that they wanted to pick up, so there was no reason for them to hold tryouts, because Cattle and Glau talked to each other and said, let's play together. Fan and June talked to each other. The whole team got together and talked to each other and decided, we want to play together, so there's no reason for them to hold tryouts. Moving on to Team Freedom. Team Freedom in the offseason lost Dansky and Cure, two of their flex players. Cure was playing melee primarily, and Dansky was playing flex primarily. When both of those players were lost, they had two sort of ranged-ish, flex-ish roles that they needed to fill with new players. Yoda is a very easy pickup for that team. He has a versatile hero pool. He was a big breakout star last year, both in his performance at Midseason Brawl with Roll20, as well as his impact on Superstars when he joined that team. He's an up-and-coming star within the HGC. So he's an easy replacement for Dansky because he brings some of that versatility, as well as actually more high-level experience than Dansky had when he joined Team Freedom. So it's either a side grade or a potential upgrade with a known quantity that you know is going to perform well and have the potential to perform even better in this new roster. In addition to Yoda, they picked up Lutano, who was far and away the most impressive player on Even and Death throughout their short time in the HGC, and even in Open Division before they were brought up through the B-Step collapse during the mid-season. Everyone that watched Open Division was highly praising Lutano's skills. So he's an HGC veteran. He's got high upside being so young within the scene, and he's clearly a talented player that Team Freedom has seen enough tape on to know is a good player who is going to potentially be the next Cure. You know, Cure was an unproven player that was just a standout on Heroes of the Dorm as well as in solo queue, and Team Freedom took a risk on him that played out with them making it to BlizzCon and doing phenomenally better than anyone predicted them doing. So as a result, they kind of follow that same formula by bringing in Lutano. So by bringing in Yoda and Lutano, they've brought in two known quantities that are dramatically better than a lot of their other options, because like Glaurung and Fan were not options because they went immediately to Tempo Storm. They were never really free agents. So they weren't an option for Team Freedom to pick up. So they picked up two of the best free agents that they could and players that fit into the holes that they had in their roster. So there's no reason for them to do tryouts. Moving on to Gale Force Esports, GFE is another organization that's always been at the top of North America. They want to win right now. They want to reestablish themselves after a disappointing end to last year by missing BlizzCon. So they don't want to take risks on low, not proven, high upside players. They want to take known quantities that they can plug into their roster and keep themselves at the top of the league. With Fury being released by Tempo, he's a very easy pickup for the team to improve their tank role over King Caffeine. He's arguably the best free agent that was available in North America. So that's a very simple pickup for GFE. There's no reason for them to try out any other tank players because they can get the best one that was available. Now, looking at the two Naventic/Lagforce players that they brought on, Big Impact and B-Kid, these to some casual viewers will look like risky pickups that maybe should have had to try out. But I think this is an opportunity to talk a little bit about Lagforce and why players within the HGC are still very high on a number of players that were on that team, even though everybody that was watching watched them completely fall apart over 2017. Every single player on Lagforce is a highly talented player. They have phenomenal mechanical skills, they have great hero pools, they are veterans within the scene that have proven histories of success within the scene. A lot of people forget that the Bob Ross fan club that had many of these same players was a dominant force within the scene, and that Naventic was a very strong force in the scene for a long time. So these players have proven themselves to be talented players. It was just that combination of personalities and players on that team, with Zuna having to tank, with B-Kid not being able to find success as a tank, with Kenma not being a great support, with, as we've seen now, Naventic being kind of a shady, terrible organization for these players to have to deal with. There were a lot of extenuating circumstances that caused Lagforce as a team to fail. And as we saw in the Crucible, they were still worlds better than Imported Support was, having defeated them twice in a row in the Crucible. So each of these players individually is very talented, and if you put them in the right team, they could have enormous success. So Big Impact is a great ranged player that now with a high caliber support, a high caliber tank leading the way for him, that might enable him to perform dramatically better than he was when he was relegated to this weird flex position with Lagforce. In a similar way, B-Kid actually impressed quite a lot in his Melee debut towards the later stages of 2017. If you go back and watch his Malthael, if you go back and watch some of his other champions or other heroes that he actually played pretty well. Again, it's just that overall combination of that team that just couldn't put it together against the better teams in the region that had better, more established rosters, had better tanks in the front line, had better support play. You know, Tomster is still a very new support even at the end of the season. So even though these two players didn't have a great 2017, they're great players that plug immediately into Gale Force, and again, because of that disparity with the Open Division, give them a much better chance of retaking their spot near the top of the HGC without having to take that risk on unproven talent. They know these players, they know who they are as people, they know how they'll fit with the other personalities. It just makes sense for them to pick up those players. And then lastly, we get to Roll20, who we've already heard on Troll and HGC. Their manager, Yitboss, confirmed that they wanted Dansky in the offseason, so they went and got him. There's no reason for them to try out that position because they got the player that they wanted. And then Cure reached out to the team and was far and away the most impressive rookie in the HGC last year. So why on earth would you not pick him up when he's proven himself to be incredibly talented, to have some great leadership qualities to him, to have a better hero pool that fits with the team for what they need, having picked up Dansky for a flex role, and he has synergy with Dansky with the two of them having been on a team last year. So it's a really natural fit, and when you have those options, there's no reason for you to have tryouts for anybody else, because you basically got two of the best free agents you possibly could have to fill the two holes in your roster that you had when Glaurung and Prismaticism left the team. So all of these teams that are near the top of the HGC had great options of free agents that they could pick up to either keep their rosters stable or to potentially improve them. There's no reason for them to reach any further than that to look out for other options for their teams. So now let's take a look at the teams that didn't have that same luxury, Space Station and Old Gods. Looking at Space Station Gaming, early on they dropped two players. So they had two holes that they needed to fill. And all of the free agents that we just talked about, the Furies, the Cures, the Glaurungs, these players had better options than Space Station Gaming. Space Station Gaming was kind of a middle-of-the-road team, and all of the players that we talked about earlier had better offers than going to Space Station Gaming that gives them a better chance to stay near the top of the HGC. So there's no reason for those players to join Space Station Gaming without a tryout, so Space Station kind of has to look elsewhere to fill those holes. So they had options of players that didn't make it onto teams like Sray and Cawthon, but as those players didn't make it onto teams, it's reasonable for us to assume that they weren't players that any team felt needed to be on a team without a tryout. It's possible that those players tried out for positions with these teams and ultimately did not prove themselves to be the best option available for these teams. And Space Station specifically didn't really need a Sray or a Cawthon to fill the holes in their roster that they have. They really needed a primary ranged player, and they really needed a support player. And the available options didn't really fill those roles phenomenally well. So instead, they decided to look elsewhere, and they ultimately picked up Jay Schritt and Tomster through a tryout process, because Jay Schritt was an unproven talent. He impressed a lot at BlizzCons, but that was him breaking out of a wild card region that doesn't have a ton of overwhelmingly talented players that have established themselves. So he's still unproven in terms of competing against other NAHGC teams. So he needed to try out for his position. And similarly with the support role, Tomster is still pretty new to that role. So it's reasonable. I have not confirmed that Tomster actually had to try out for his role, but I know that Jay Schritt did. And so these two players were both unproven in their roles, are in relatively new roles for their careers, and so it's reasonable for Space Station to have tried them out against other open division talent, other HGC free agents that weren't good enough to find homes on the better teams, and ultimately make the decision that they made. But they were in a position where they essentially had to have tryouts because there was no one available to them that was good enough to immediately grab without having some tryouts. So that's Space Station. Now, moving on to our last team, Old Gods, they released two players, and then Yoda was picked up by Team Freedom, so they had 3 holes in their roster that they needed to fill. Again, this is a lower-level team within the HGC, so none of the high-profile free agents that we talked about earlier are going to want to join Old Gods if they have better offers on the table. However, Old Gods still picked up 3 pretty high-profile free agents, so it would be reasonable for someone to say, Zuna is a player that a lot of people have really high opinions of, that watch the HGC regularly or that play against him. So there's really not a ton of reason for him to have to try out. And then K1 and King Caffeine are established veterans that have been to BlizzCon again and again, that you know exactly what you're getting with their talent. So you could essentially pick them up without having to make them try out, and no one would be especially surprised. However, all 3 players have question marks going into their spot on Old Gods, specifically because of where they were before and the holes that this roster had to fill. You know, Zuna and K1 would essentially be competing for the same position if they both kept their best position as their primary position trying out for this team. K1 is mainly a primary ranged, and Zuna at his best was a ranged carry with some Zeratul in his pocket. And Zuna's been playing tank and melee forever. He's been in this weird flexy role for the past almost year and a half now. It's reasonable for old gods to want to see him in that primary range role pitted against other players that have been playing that role as their primary role for a whole year in the open division, to make sure that Zuna still has his ranged chops there with all of the patches that have come out since that was his primary role before, with all of the new heroes that have come out, with the way that the meta has shifted. You want to make sure that he's still got everything in place to be a top level ranged player if you're going to bring him onto your team. So you try him out against a couple of other options. K1 was trying out for the support role. I've talked to some people in the scene, and K1 actually has been interested in moving to the support role for some time now, but he's never played it at a competitive level, and so you really don't know what you're getting with K1 as a support. So it would be reasonable for old gods to say, okay, before we're going to bring in this package deal of Caffeine and K1, if we're also going to pick up Zuna for the range role and K1 wants to be a support, we've got to see him actually play support in some scrims before we pick him up. So you make him try out against other supports to see if he's the right fit. And then Caffeine is actually directly competing for his role with a current player on Old Gods in Erho. Erho's been a primary tank and a great primary tank in the league for a long time. So if you're going to pick up Caffeine, you've got to make sure that he's actually a better tank than Erho is. If he's not, then you want to try him out against some open division tanks as well if Erho's going to move to melee, or you want to try out some open division melee players, potentially even Jay Shrita and some of these other players, so that you make sure that you're building the best roster you possibly can. So, even though Caffeine is an established player, because Erho was also competing for his spot and potentially moving to melee, there's a lot of question marks for old gods at that melee and tank role, so you need to take some time and explore all of your options there, because you don't have obvious pickups like Fan or like Fury, some of these high-profile players that would be an easy slot in. You have sort of a question mark in Caffeine, who's a very established player, but didn't have that elite season that someone like Fury or Justin did. So, ultimately, at the end of the day, most esports franchises are always going to be risk-averse, especially when there's a relegation process like there is in the HGC. Anytime you make roster changes, you are risking those roster changes failing catastrophically like they have for LagForce and Niventic in the past, and ending up in the Crucible and having your entire organization crumble to shambles because you got relegated by an open division team. As a result of that, any team that can avoid the risk of having question mark players that would warrant a tryout are going to avoid it every time. And those that don't have that clear answer are then going to move to tryouts and look for new or unproven players or question mark players that have upside. So I hope that answers the question that was asked. If you'd like to have your question asked on entry-level esports, be sure to follow TrollsGG on Twitter and myself, Trent_esports. And next week when we put out the request for questions, we might pick yours to answer on episode 3. Hope you have a great one, and we'll see you next time.